Okay. We have about 46 of the 120 people on board, so we'll just wait a little longer until all attendees register in. We've also initiated an initial poll to ask all attendees how familiar are they with the TMF reference model, and we've given 4 answers. So if you can please respond to our poll, we'd be appreciative. Attendees are still logging in. I'm just going to give it another 60 seconds. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, The Evolution of the TMF Reference Model. Today we have an international group of panelists with us that will take you through the actual presentation. Karen Roy from Flex Global, Todd Tullis from Viva Systems, and Wendy Trimboli from ESI. We've initiated a poll, and we're about to close it. What it does show is 93% of the respondents were either very familiar or somewhat familiar with the TMF reference model, with the remaining percentage having heard of it somewhat before. So we thank you for responding to our poll. It seems that everyone is familiar somewhat with the actual reference model, and we're going to go now into our presentation. Okay, so we'll start off with Karen, if you would like to start off with the presentation.
Actually, Jim, I'm going to.
Thank you very much, Jim.
Yeah, this is Todd Tullis. Hi, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining. So we're going to take you through today some information about version 3 of the TMF reference model, Karen and I, and then Wendy will follow with a case study around implementing the model. So you can advance to the next slide, Jim.
Second, Todd. Okay.
All right, so just a little baseline, and it sounds like most of the folks on the phone are familiar with the TMF reference model, and therefore I presume with trial master files themselves, but so most of us should know that the trial master file is a regulatory requirement, and in plain language I've best heard it explained as it needs to tell the story of a clinical trial. So this is one example of an EU regulation that specifically calls out the trial master file as being essential documents. And you can go to the next slide, Jim. So essential documents, what are those? You know, ICH provides us with some immediate definitions of what an essential document is and what it might include. And so we look to ICH first as a global research community, and there we find some information about what essential documents are. However, if you go to the next slide, Jim, ICH talks about the minimum list of essential documents and lists those out. And in the opinion of industry, it was determined that GCP does not provide a comprehensive list of contents that would tell the story of a trial. There was no other inventory that was really agreeable and commonly understood by industry. And so this initiative to define a TMF reference model was initiated. And so if you go to the next slide, Jim. And so what is that? What is that list? And well, we have the minimum list of essential documents in ICH, and if you build that out, Jim, you can see there are other records that companies collect in the conduct of a trial, in the planning, the conduct, execution of a trial that they may consider. You can build it out one more time, Jim. So if we look at the universe of types of records that may exist out there, the trial master file is an attempt to define those records, and it is a company-by-company decision in terms of what is included in the scope of the TMF, and that's part of what the trial master file reference model initiative is designed to do, is to bring together folks from industry to define, what are in these buckets here that we see. More specifically, what should they be called? How should they be organized? And come to a common agreement on something that we can all reference and work from. So how did this all happen? You can go to the next slide, Jim. It started in 2009 with one of the DIA SIAC groups, Special Interest Area Committees on Document and Records Management. A group of folks got together and decided we should, for the reasons we just covered, should start an initiative to do this. That produced in 2010 the first version of the TMF reference model. In 2012, produced version 2 of the TMF reference model, and now in 2015 we have version 3. And along this path, there's been a large number of contributors globally from various types of companies: pharmaceutical, medical device, small biotech, consultants, vendors, regulators. All kinds of folks have come together around this effort to define a TMF reference model. And you can go to the next slide. So what does the TMF reference model look like? Sounds like most of the folks on the call today are familiar with this, but it's divided into 11 zones. So zone is the highest level of organization, and below each zone there are sections and artifacts, artifacts being the lowest level of organization. And so here you can see the 11 zones the TMF reference model is currently divided into, at least in its version 1, 2, and 3 incarnations. And under each of those zones there are, go ahead, Jim.
Sure.
You can go ahead and move ahead. There are artifacts, and those artifacts, you can build out this slide, Jim. There's a couple builds here. There you go. So an artifact is a document or record type, and the word document can be a little misleading because these artifacts could be data files, other kinds of media, or digitized content. It doesn't necessarily have to be a document. And there are 248 artifacts in the model, divided again within those 11 zones. We also have alternate names in the model provided because our industry doesn't necessarily align on the same terminology, and some things have names in different regions or different facets of industry. And most importantly, a definition purpose to describe what types of records belong in a given artifact. And so that's just a little bit about the organization of the model, which I presume most folks are familiar with. There's one more explanation of kind of how the model is structured on the next slide, which is into the, and this is a one build out, Jim, so you can build that out. So each artifact is indicated as trial, country, and site level. And some artifacts are relevant to more than one level. And the principles behind the TMF reference model are intended to be applicable to both electronic and paper TMF. So in the electronic world, the study, the country, and the site that's relevant for a given artifact would be considered metadata. But in a paper world, we would have a country level file, a site level file, and a study level file. And that's just some brief overview of the structure of the TMF reference model as it's been defined to date. And some of the screenshots you're seeing are from version 3 of the model. None of the things we've covered here so far are changed in 3.0, but what we want to talk about now is the project that we undertook since about October of last year to develop version 3.0 of the TMF reference model from version 2.0. And you can go to the next slide. So as I mentioned, this project began back in October with the TMF reference model steering committee, and we broadly arranged the project into 3 phases. One was the zone meetings, so we had volunteers assigned to each of the 11 zones, and they worked individually in their zone teams to create drafts. Those drafts then went up to the steering committee for review with the zone leads, kind of a joint review. And finally, we had a final review among all the TMF reference model group members before we released the model. And so just a note in terms of Karen and myself, we played the role of controllers, which is essentially the project manager for this. So we were part of the TMF reference model steering committee. We planned out the project and went on. So as I mentioned earlier, the reference model group has grown to a large number of people. We want to make the TMF reference model better for everybody and apply learnings from version 2.0. We wanted to get a result the industry could continue to stand behind, and we found a fantastic group of volunteers representing many facets of industry. And you can build this once, Jim. You can see the diversity that we had in terms of the people directly involved with the zone teams, the communication team, the technical team, all the people who are actively working on version 3.0. This is not inclusive of the larger group that actually reviewed the final draft. So it's really great to get all these folks from different companies together and contributing towards this important goal. And as we dive into the details of what version 3 is, I'm going to have Karen cover some of the immediate highlights.
Thank you, Todd. We're very excited to be presenting this today. I have to say that this is our second webinar, and again it was full. The last one was full, so for those of you who managed to get on this one this time round, great. We tried to give you all the heads up to get in there, but it's still full. We are going to be recording, I'm sure Jim will talk about that, making it available on the tmfreferencemodel.com website. The excitement around this is brilliant. It's been, as Todd said, it's been reviewed by literally hundreds of people. And the fact that 93% of you on the call know about the TMF reference model, it's not just the people involved in the reference model that are on this webinar today, it's a variety of other people. So we're delighted that the word is spreading wide and far. Please, you are our ambassadors, please take it out, tell other people, every regulator you meet, every auditor you meet, all your CROs, everybody, make sure they know about it. So what have we done? Well, we've actually done a variety of different things. Todd's going to go into the details of exactly what's changed, but in summary, we've updated some artifacts, we've added some in, taken some out, consolidated, split them out, left them the same, and I think one of the important things to understand is our driver all the way through in terms of getting to V3 was very much, do we have to do this? Because obviously a lot of you have already implemented V2, and so we wanted to make sure that V2 to V3 was as simple as possible. And I'll talk a lot about that when we get to the following slides. We've updated some zones. Todd again will talk you through some of the zones where really it just wasn't logical where some things were sitting. The challenge, of course, is that you could put things in different zones. So randomization could be in the IP zone, it could be in the stat zone. Neither is wrong. We had to make a choice, so we've chosen to stay with where things are for most occasions, but a couple of times to move things. Definitions have been updated. Some of them, I must admit, had rather rough grammar in them because I think we put them together slightly fast, so we've really tidied them up and sorted them out. I'll talk a lot more about sub-artifacts. We've actually included the concept of sub-artifact. In other words, to give deeper granularity to the reference model. Presentation, now there is a new version of the presentation that's going to be out. I'm going to talk through it. I know one of the questions immediately will be when is it available. I don't know the answer, and I meant to find out before today, so I will double check, and we will include that in the communications as to when it will be available. There's a user guide, again, something that is available on the TMF reference model website and on the DIA websites. And I'd really appreciate, or we would appreciate, any feedback on the user guide. So if you have in your user guide, if you read the user guide and you see that maybe there are some things that don't make sense, would really appreciate you actually being able to feedback what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. And I'll talk a little bit about the communication and how we've communicated to the world. But obviously these webinars are very important parts of the communication. So if we drill in and talk about how the changes are shown. So as I mentioned, a lot of you have already used V2 of the reference model. So we really tried to make sure that there was a markup between V2 and V3 for traceability. So you could look at your V2 reference model and go, okay, that artifact has changed names, that artifact has changed zones. We've obviously maintained the unique number associated with every artifact. We've maintained that all the way through. So you can always see where an artifact has moved to. The other thing we've done is try and maintain the numbering, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So on the next slide, we'll actually see the types of examples of changes that we've done. So if you press the first, and as I talk, Jim, you can just build, this is the first one. So for example, we actually moved the laboratory testing from, the local laboratory testing from Zone 5 to Zone 8. And so we changed the name of the zone to centralized and local testing. We added in some extra artifacts. All the extra artifacts are highlighted in yellow. We thought very hard about adding an extra artifact. I would say that we had a request for lots and lots of new artifacts, and we argued every single one to say, do we have to have it? Is it really needed? It's only when we felt they were really needed that we actually put them in. The next thing we did, as I said, was look at the definitions, and some of them just weren't quite right, and some of them, the grammar wasn't quite right, and some of them repeated themselves, so we tried to clarify that and make it better. And the last one on here, I think, is to show you how the structure of the reference model looks. So if you look at the bottom, you'll see V3 markup. The V3 markup is the one that shows you how it's gone from V2 to V3. Then there's the updated model overview, instructions, and a tab on CSV. For those of you who don't know, we had a lot of debate at one stage about putting in Zone 12 on related to CSV, and we decided rather just to give some guidance in a separate tab. So this is effectively what the markup looks like. If you go to the next one, you'll actually see what the reference model looks like. Now, the first thing we did, just so you can see this is definitely version 3, is it's no longer a Christmas tree of color. We had the feedback that maybe it was slightly too bright, so we thought what we'd do is just tone it down a bit. But the nice thing about toning it down is, and it ties in nicely with our logo, which is blue as well, is that it shows that it's definitely the next version. So you're not under any illusion which version you've picked up. And it's here I really want to talk, if you press again, Jim, about sub-artifacts. So let me explain what a sub-artifact is. A sub-artifact is a document type, effectively, that sits within an artifact. So the structure of the reference model, zone, section, artifact, and what we're recommending to people to do is to maintain that structure, that zone, section, artifact structure, which sort of gives a nice standardization. And if you think about it, if the CROs use zone, section, and artifact, if the pharma companies use it, so when pharma company A buys pharma company B, which seems to happen every 20 minutes at the moment, or CRO A merges with CRO B, then they're all using the same zone, section, and artifact. And what we're saying is use sub-artifacts as a way to really insert your company processes. So what's in a TMF? Yes, there's a set of artifacts that we have within the TMF reference model, but it's also everything in your SOPs. So if your SOP says you need a certain type of form or a certain type of approval on a certain colored paper, then you need to be collecting those things into your TMF. And that's where you can really expand the sub-artifacts. So where you may have a quality plan as an artifact.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
So at this point in time, I'm a little bit confused because it's just told me that all attendees are in listen-only mode. which potentially means that everyone's only been listening up until now. At this point, I think there's been a small audio problem. Jim, can I just confirm whether you've had any feedback on any audio problems? Because I've had a couple of emails.
I've had just a couple of emails, Karen, but I did not see this, and all of a sudden I just saw the broadcast.
I would appreciate it if someone could put a comment into the question panel to say whether they've been listening to us all the way through. Be really appreciative if you could. Or if someone could comment that they could now hear us.
I haven't seen any questions, Karen.
Okay, so just to let you know that it looks like we've been showing a silent movie. I know the TMF reference model is a very, very fascinating thing, but I'm sure on silence it's not quite as good as it is with the wording going through. So I think, bearing in mind we still have 65 attendees on this webinar, what we will commit to doing is we will commit to re-recording and sending out the rest. But for those of you who can now hear us, welcome back. We are talking through the reference model. We're talking through SubArtifacts, and I'm going to carry on from here and talk about the importance of SubArtifacts. And I also believe that the question mode isn't working as well. So thank you for the person who's emailed me and just let me know. But I've got information on email. So actually, Todd, can I ask a very quick favor? Could I ask you to go back 2 slides, please? So we can go back to the So What's in V3. Just for those of you who haven't heard, just as a quick summary of what's in version 3 of the reference model. So, Jim, sorry, Jim, can you go back to 3 slides, please? Sorry. Thank you. Back one more. Okay, so...
One more slide in total, Karen?
Yeah, go back to the So What's in V3. The next one back. Thank you very much. So what is it? Okay, as you might have seen, and now you're going to hear, it was reviewed by hundreds of people. And the slides will show you all the different people and the process that followed if you look at them later. What we did was, as I mentioned, was we updated artifacts, we added some in, we took some out, we consolidated, we split out, we left the same. And the most important part here is that we tried our hardest not to change the reference model too much. So we really concentrated on questioning every change that was requested. A lot of you use V2 of the reference model, and we wanted to make sure it was easy as possible to move to V3. We updated some zones, and I'll go through some examples in a bit. We looked at definitions. Some of the definitions were really very, were a little outdated or not necessarily very accurate, so we changed those. We added in SubArtifacts, which I will go through. We've improved the presentation, again, something we'll be showing you, and we produced a user guide and a communication plan. From the user guide perspective, for those of you who can actually get to review the user guide, really appreciate your feedback and your thoughts on how the user guide works. If I go to the next slide, please. Can I request a quick thing of everybody on the call? As we've seen the questions on This Is Not Working, if you have any questions, could you please email them to me at kroy@flexglobal.com. That's PHLEXGLOBAL.com, and I will read out the questions and put them to the panel. So we will definitely be able to solve this problem, no problem at all. So moving on to the reference model V3 with the markup. So what you can see in front of you is the markup page. The markup page will show you exactly where V2 goes to V3. So for example, zones, the centralized testing zone, we actually moved all the local labs into that, so we changed it to central and local testing. The ones in yellow are the new artifacts, and as I mentioned, we were very, very careful not to add too many new artifacts. For any new artifacts that were requested, we went through and we really assessed, do we really need these new artifacts? The next thing we did was we looked at the definitions and we said, okay, so what are we going to do about these definitions? How do we make them clearer? We made sure the definitions were clear and applicable across the globe. And so if you go to the next bubble, just shows you that this is where V3 markup is in terms of the reference model. Going to the next page, you will see that we actually changed the color. And for those of you who didn't hear, it no longer looks like a sparkly Christmas tree. It's now a much more muted color, blue, which goes with the logo of the reference model and sort of the image of the reference model. And the nice thing about this is you can actually see whether it's that this is version 3. So as soon as you open it, you know you've got the new version of the reference model. And one of the things that I wanted to talk about in a bit more detail was the sub-artifacts. So the sub-artifacts are basically document types that form part of the artifact. Now, the artifacts are where we're trying to get interoperability. We're trying to encourage everyone to use the TMF reference model exactly as it is, zone, section, artifact. And then when you get to the artifact and you want to include all your company-specific document types, put them into sub-artifacts. So put them in, and that might be approvals you need, it might be specific forms you need, it might be specific meeting notes, review comments, anything that you have, put them into sub-artifacts. And that way then, if you buy another company, if you're a sponsor, if you merge with another company, if you're a CRO, if you hand documents back from a CRO to a sponsor, if everybody uses the same artifact names, and if everybody uses all the same artifact numbers as well associated, it will really help with interoperability. So if you build up the slide, please, Jim, you'll see that that's where it's highlighted where the sub-artifacts are. And the other thing just to say that we did look at again was the core and recommended. There's been a lot of discussion around what does core mean, what does recommended mean, and just a reminder that the core artifacts are really those that we as a group, all the regulations, all the guidance say you have to have those documents. We actually took out the if applicables all the way through because in reality, if there's no diary in a study, then it can't be core. So we've just cleaned that column up to core and recommended. And you'll notice the other thing we've done on that column there is that we've cleaned up the investigator documents. In the past, we had some crazy idea of no CS, XS, XG, and nobody really understood what that meant, least of all those of us who put the codes in. So what we've done is we've made it very simply. Sponsor document, investigator document. If it's an X, it's applicable. If it's a no, it's not. So again, keeping it very, very simple. Going to the next slide, just a little bit more sort of thoughts about sub-artifacts. This will depend on how you use it. If you're in a paper world, you may have separate dividers for sub-artifacts. In an electronic world, you may have separate folders for sub-artifacts. If you are a hierarchical driven eTMF, you may have it as a fourth level. But essentially what it does is it just gives greater granularity of the sub-artifacts. And if you go to the next page, we've actually got a really nice example of all the different types of sub-artifacts that have been included. Now, important to point out, these are just examples. This is not an exhaustive list. And one of the things we're talking about doing is getting the zones back together and having each zone look at the sub-artifacts and say what are the sub-artifacts that are applicable to that zone, to that zone and the artifacts in that zone. So I'm going to hand back to Todd now, just to go through a little bit more detail of the real sort of granularity of what's changed.
Yep, thanks, Karen. So I'll take you through several changes and new additions to TMF Reference Model version 3. First of which here is the trial committee section in Zone 1. So in version 2, there was a data adjudication section and artifact specific for that, and different types of committees were specifically called out. But the team felt that there's a more flexible way to handle the various kinds of committees and the records that result from the use of those committees on any clinical trial, and that was through a more flexible section here that you can see indicates the different types of artifacts that we expect to come out of committee work on a trial. And you can go to the next slide, Jim. Karen mentioned this as well, the simplified notation for identifying the sponsor versus site file. So she covered that previously. We can go on to the next. So here's an interesting summary of the new, moved, and removed artifacts. So the net number here isn't too high, but there's a decent amount of changes here. You can see Zone 2, the committee artifacts certainly are new in terms of being more specific about the committee items. But you can also see in Zone 5 we've added something for coordinating investigators, and in Zone 9 we showed that earlier, some of the new third-party artifacts. And you can see that one artifact has been moved, zones, and then we've had several artifacts removed, and again, a lot of those related to those committee artifacts in Zone 1 that were there before. So a few other changes of interest, and I think we mentioned this earlier on the silent portion of the call, but Zone 8 was centralized testing, and it's now central and local testing, and so the local lab artifacts have now moved into Zone 8 to represent that new zone. We've refreshed the mapping of artifacts to the EDM reference model for anybody who is familiar with that or works in the regulatory area. Now you can see which artifacts in the TMF reference model you might need to be aware of for submission purposes. And we've also replaced some specific characters in the model with terms. This was done so that certain systems could, wouldn't have to deal with folder names with possibly illegal characters and things like that that electronic systems sometimes do not like. Another significant change here is a renaming of the first section in Zone 2 to product and trial documentation. And so this was done as a response to give more flexibility in terms of handling device trials as well as other types of products and marketed products. There's one new artifact here added, which is at the very end, their marketed product material. But otherwise, by grouping these documents all into one section that is clearly labeled product and trial documentation, we can call out those product documents that might be product records that might be reused on multiple trials. So another really important new addition to the TMF reference model project is what we're calling the TMF Exchange Mechanism. And so this is a mechanism to facilitate electronic exchange of trial master file content from one organization to another. And there are several reasons and cases when this might be useful. Karen covered a couple of them. Certainly a CRO providing services for a sponsor would potentially need to transfer that TMF content over to that sponsor. Some sponsors have multiple systems that generate TMF records, and so you want to move those records over to potentially to your TMF system of record at some point in time. And we've got obviously the acquisition scenario and other things. And so what we set out to do, we had a sub-team involved in the project that set out to do this to really focus first on just content transfer. So we're not so worried about the real-time interoperability. That's more of a long-term goal. We wanted a standard, simple mechanism to transfer TMF content electronically from one place to another. We also wanted to frame it in the context of existing standards such as eCTD for submissions and CDISC for clinical data. So if you go to the next slide, Jim. I won't cover the exact format of the XML here, but a little bit of the how for everybody's awareness is there is an XML structure that's been defined that provides specific tags for the identifiers that are necessary. So some of the identifiers that are necessary is a mapping back to the TMF reference model artifact that this piece of content falls under, as well as its study and perhaps its site. And there are a few other key pieces of metadata that we expect to relate to any piece of content. And so this exchange mechanism format, we've got a starting point. It covers what we consider the minimum amount of metadata that you need to transfer a piece of content. So, TMF reference model version, artifact identifier, and then certain metadata based on the type of artifact. If it needs a study, needs a site, needs a country, things like that. And we're reviewing this now with the vendor community, and we expect to have a final product a little bit later in the summer or the early fall. But it's an exciting project, and it's been fun. I was also involved in this. It's been fun to discuss and think about how we can take a very pragmatic approach to interoperability, because we believe it's an important problem to solve. It really helps the proliferation of standards, and it's one of the benefits of using the TMF reference model as a common framework to understand our content. So we're excited about where this one is going as well. I'll turn it back over to Karen to cover some of the other exciting new things.
Absolutely, thank you very much. So one of the things that we really thought about was, okay, how is the reference model going to be presented? How is it going to actually be shown? A lot of people have said, well, they're not necessarily comfortable with the spreadsheet, and one of the things that we're really trying to do is to try and help people understand how the flat spreadsheet can be interpreted broadly, and how it can be applied at the 3 different levels, etc. But one of the other things I think that people did was they wanted to come across, have a different way of looking at the reference model. So there was a team, a part of the technical team, and they specifically looked at the presentation. And really what their aim was to do was to have a different way of showing the reference model in some sort of digital format that doesn't require specialized software. And so if you go to the next slide, what they did, and this was led by a gentleman called David Gwynn, who has just confirmed to me that it's being revised this week and we should have it by next week at the latest. So if we tell you the week after that, I'm very excited about this. And basically what this is using a piece of software called MyMap. But the way in which it's presented, you don't have to have MyMap itself to be able to use it. And what it's done is it takes the reference model, and what you can see on the screen obviously is version 2, because version 3 wasn't ready at the time, and it breaks it all up in this first instance, and it effectively maps things. So what you do is you have everything down to a different zone, so you can see all the different zones there, and if you click on the little pluses, it'll take you into more detail. And for every single artifact, what was added was a whole bunch of attributes. So for example, whether it was core, recommended, sponsor, investigator, device, etc. Now, obviously some of this will change because the reference model itself has changed. But what you can see then is you can see by tagging the document, the actual artifact type, and now of course there'll be sub-artifact as well, you're effectively getting a way of building up information. So if you go to the next slide, you will see that you there have the ability by using what's called a power filter. So you can go in and say, show me all of those things that are core. Show me all the things that are device investigators. So instead of just seeing one flat spreadsheet, you'll be able to effectively drill down and have a nice presentation of a drill down option of the reference model. Very excited for this thing for this to be coming out. And if you go to the next slide, you will see that it's a PDF version, so it allows you to navigate everything and to see all the information about all the different things, all the different codings, without using this MindJet, My Manager license. So a really great thing. As I said, it should be out, if we say 2 weeks from now, that gives David a bit of leeway to make sure it's absolutely correct. If you go to the next slide, I'll talk about the other aspect of what we're presenting to people, and that is the user guide. So the user guide is a simple guide, and you can see on the screen you've got all the different table of contents. So what you've got there is really it's something to explain what the guide is, how it got to where it is, and then how you would use it. So I'm working at a biotech company. I don't have anything TMFE. I'm going to use the reference model. How do I go and use this particular reference model thing to create my trial master file? So it talks about mappings, it talks about looking at SOPs, it talks about just using the whole thing to create a company-specific TMF structure. There's a whole bunch of case studies which are really useful because it goes from a startup biotech to big global pharma companies. And then when you get to the back, it's more of the basic information. So Appendix A gives you a history of how it came about, and Appendix B actually tells you about the model itself. So if you've never seen it in your life before and you go, what on earth is an artifact? You can then go to the model, to the back, and see what an artifact is, how everything is split out, etc. The user guide is available on tmfreferencemodel.com. And there's communication. So a few things. We've got the webinars. We said two. If this one is recorded properly, we may just circulate the recording. If it hasn't, we will need to be doing another one so that we can get the recording right. Again, we will circulate it. There will be more webinars as well where we talk about not just the reference model v3, but we also talk about maybe a little bit more detail on how people have used it, maybe talking a little bit more about how the user guide can be used, and digging into other areas. But for now, we're definitely focused on telling everybody about v3. There's press releases, letters have gone to all the regulators that we know, and then of course there's the two big areas. One is the tmfreferencemodel.com, and that website is where we have all the links and all the documents. And then the other very, very important thing is the TMF reference model group on LinkedIn. It's about 1,500 people on there, very active group. It is limited. There are no advertisements. There are no job adverts. There's no, it's just information and education. So definitely a good place to join. Another thing I would say just on the communication front, in terms of going forth and talking about it, is that if you would like to be part of the TMF reference model group, and what that means is that you are registered in the Yahoo group, and it means that effectively I have your email address in a group email, and so every time we send information out, every time we have meetings, and it's probably once every 4 to 6 weeks, you will get an invitation. It's 1 hour every 4 to 6 weeks, and also you will get any questions that you have can come through, and they can be looked at by the steering committee because the reference model is run by a steering committee. So without further ado, you have all the email addresses on the page there. If anybody has any questions, email either Todd or I, it doesn't really matter who, and we can then look at the questions. But I'd like to now hand over to Wendy, who is actually talking about in real life what she's done with the reference model. Thank you, Wendy.
Thanks, Karen. Hi, everybody. I'm going to try to go through this quickly so we have enough time for questions. So hopefully I won't be speaking too quickly. But I'm going to be talking about how we adopted and implemented the TMF reference model, the multiple versions. So this is just the different topics I'm going to talk about. So just give a little background and history quickly, the implementation of version 1, how we developed version 2, challenges we encountered implementing version 2, and our plans for implementing version 3. So just quickly some background just to put perspective on how we use the TMF. We've utilized a global eTMF since 2010. Our eTMF system is outsourced or hosted externally, so we use an eTMF vendor. We have over 1,100 registered eTMF users globally, the majority of which are from CROs. We have 2 strategic partner CROs, but we also utilize other CROs as well for some of our studies. And we currently have 42 ongoing studies, 29 of which are in our version of the TMF reference model. And I just wanted to mention our primary therapeutic areas are oncology and neuroscience, and the reason I'm mentioning that is oncology studies tend to be long duration, so they can go on for years, and neuroscience studies can have a complicated study design. So kind of, shed some insight on when I show our timeline. So we currently have 2 file structures in use. Our legacy structures is, we still use our legacy structure for about 13 studies. So this is showing a high-level timeline, a summary of key events that have occurred in our journey from version 1 to version 3. So we began about 5 years ago. We were looking to update our file structure as it wasn't very robust or granular, and the TMF reference model had just been released. So at the end of 2010, we established a cross-functional, cross-regional TMF working group, primarily made up of clinical operations and CQA. We implemented this in the end of 2011, And this was, again, it was based on the TMF reference model version 1. It was our version. And this implementation coincided with an upgrade to our eTMF system. So subsequently in 2012, we conducted a customer satisfaction survey to all eTMF users. And that gave us information not just on the eTMF system, but also on the process and our TMF. So we had an MHRA inspection and a resulting cap at the end of 2013. And this started the beginning of discussions around implementing the full TMF reference model file structure, which would include some additional updates and clarifications to address some of the issues that we were seeing. So after a long process, our version 2 of our reference model was recently released in May, and we just recently completed implementation training and rollout to all functional areas. So we're starting to collect and evaluate change requests for based on the version 3 for potential updates. So implementing version 1, as I mentioned, we had a working group made up of clinical operations with input from CQA and used the TMF reference model version 1 as a starting point and customized it based on ASI's TMF practices and policies. So it did not include all the zones. It was very clinical operations focused, but it did provide more detail and granularity than our old structure. As I said, it was implemented at the end of 2011, and we basically drew a line in the sand and used it for all new studies moving forward. Any ongoing studies were evaluated for potential mapping or converting to the new structure. And at the time, the decisions were made by the individual study teams, mostly driven by cost based on the number of documents that were already present in the system that would have to be mapped over. So what happened was the majority of studies that were started in 2011 were converted over. If I knew then what I knew now, I would have tried to convince, I think, more teams to convert more of the ongoing studies, since we still ultimately have 13 ongoing studies in our old structure. Next slide. So the road to development of version 2, events that occurred in 2012, 2013. The TMF reference model version 12 was released in 2012, but we opted at the time not to make any changes to our file structure because the changes that resulted in version 2 didn't really have an impact on us. So we did not change it at that time. As I mentioned, we had conducted a customer satisfaction survey to all eTMF users to primarily gain feedback on the eTMF system, but we also got a lot of information related to process and the file structure. And some of the feedback included confusion about what actually got submitted to the eTMF versus what remained in ASI's internal systems, and also requests for guidance on what should go to each section. So based on this feedback, we made a minor update to our file structure at the time. We added a location column, and then we also added a document example column just to provide some additional guidance. And then we had an MHRA inspection at the end of 2013, and the resulting CAPA drove many of the additional updates that were developed and subsequently implemented. Next slide. So the strategy for development of version 2, this is kind of critical because this often the strategy that's taken really determines how successful an implementation is. So we understood that it had to come from the top down, and we approached the heads of each functional area with the TMF reference model background and the rationale for developing the full reference model. So this meant going out to other functional areas that had not at that time been part of the TMF file structure. And we had to get the buy-in from the heads of the functional areas. We enlisted CQA support. And we did a combination of in-person meetings, WebEx meetings, and offline asking for review and comments. And we were trying to tackle a lot at once, so we weren't just updating the file structure, but we're also adding new functional areas, adding guidance and clarity, presenting decisions on official location and agreement to be the responsible functional area. So there was a lot going on, and I'll show on the next slide the challenges that we encountered. But we also had to review the company SOPs, so across all functions, to ensure alignment and identify where updates had to occur. So a lot of the SOPs talk about handoffs to other functions regarding assuming the role, send copy of something to the TMF. So we had to make sure that all the SOPs were in line with the changes we were making. And, like I said, we had CQA help us convince some of the functional groups on what was required to be part of the TMF and why some locations would not be adequate. So our key challenges, or the main challenges, was, again, we heard the constant question, what has to go to the eTMF? What's required to go to the eTMF? Is this required? So a lot of them were seeing the TMF reference model file structure for the first time, and again, they questioned the content and just why all those things had to be part of it. So again, we had to do a lot of educating, a lot of explaining, and so a lot of selling. Also with the multiple locations and making decision on what would go where, what would go to the eTMF versus remaining in the current location, this was a challenge because, again, it was new to a lot of areas and we had to ensure consistency across groups. And for the most part, we were able to get alignment. Other challenges that we encountered was due to the long time span. So it was about a year and a half start to finish. We experienced company restructuring, several staff changes, and we often had to start over with new department heads and sometimes new departments. So that posed a challenge. And it also opened up discussion within the different functional areas on questioning their current processes. So that they were questioning what they were doing, and maybe we should change this. Maybe we don't want to continue to do it this way. So, there was a lot of little things that we didn't anticipate that happened along the way. Next slide. So implementing version 2, like I said, we had many updates. We, the TMF file structure was aligned. We aligned it with version 2 of the reference model to better facilitate future updates. That meant there were additional zones and artifacts. We included data management and statistics. We added comprehensive document type examples for each artifact and submission guidance. So this is similar to what Karen was talking about with the SubArtifacts. So instead of calling them SubArtifacts, we actually had, we call them document type examples, but it's essentially the same thing. So we customized that column. So looking at the artifact, we put anything that could potentially be submitted to that artifact. So again, it was an exercise in looking at everything unique to us, and this is where it would be specific company to company. What do we require to go to the TMF to be submitted? And then the document type example column would show what goes to which artifact. So instead of leaving it up to the document submitters to decide what artifact they feel their document should go to, by putting it in a specific column and spelling it out, it provides that clarity and guidance and ensures that everybody is following a standardized approach. We also took it a step further and gave guidance on how the document should be submitted. So did we want it to be submitted electronically as an upload, or did we want it to be sent to the eTMF vendor as the original that would be scanned and then put into the system that way? So we wanted to standardize that process as well. We also included columns to document the location. So we did have the document location column there, but we did have to reevaluate it. We included a lot more functional areas contributing to the TMF, so we had to pretty much redo that, reevaluate that, and make sure that it was consistent across all the different submitters. And we also added columns on responsible function. So this was key. This was identifying which function was responsible for each artifact, and also a column to show who would send to the TMF. So because we have a lot of CRO submitters, we wanted it to be clear whether it would be ASI submitting something to the TMF or the CRO. And then we created TMF filing plan templates that take that a step further and customize for every single study. You have, you could call it a TMF plan, but it shows the file structure and it shows exactly what's going to be in the TMF for that study and who's responsible for submitting it. Next slide. So these are just some screenshots to show what our version of the structure looks like, and based on the colors you can see it's more like version 2 than version 3. But this shows the document type example column and the submission guidance. Next slide. This shows the location column, and again, you know, we were looking for compliance or validated systems, a cost-effective approach, and that the approach be standardized and consistent across units. Next slide. Responsible function, and this is just a listing of, at our company, all the different functional areas that have contributing responsibilities for the TMF. So clinical operations, CQA, data management, biostatistics, clinical trial supplies, pharmacovigilance, regulatory operations, business operations, medical writing, and legal. Next slide. And then this is the last column that shows who actually sends to the eTMF. And this is something that has to be customized from study to study, but it'll have a general guidance on our file structure. Next slide. So the TMF filing plan, this is, as I said, it's study specific. The way we utilize it, we created this template and we tried to make it as easy as possible for our ClinOps leads, who are the ones who are responsible for creating this. So basically the template is the file structure, and we included the key columns that would show the artifact, the document type examples, the location column to show the official location, the responsible function, and who sends to the eTMF. So, you know, the goal is everyone can easily see what is located where and who is responsible. So whether it's a regulatory inspector looking at it, or if it's somebody working on a study that needs to know where to submit something, you know, it's user-friendly that way. Next slide. So how we implemented version 2. Prior to implementation, and as I mentioned, you know, the whole development took about 1.5 years. We communicated planned updates at the various functional area department meetings. We wanted to make sure groups were aware of what was coming, and so we made sure we communicated that. And once it was approved, we scheduled and conducted several WebEx training sessions, and we customized them to each functional area that contributed content to the TMF. So we wanted to make sure that everyone knew exactly what their role was, and ultimately, you know, there would be less errors, less rework, less system queries. So we had specialized sessions for clinical operations, CQA, the CROs, data management, biostatistics, clinical trial supplies. I think we conducted about probably close to 20 WebEx training sessions. Next slide. So the plans for implementing version 3. So for the rest of this year, we'll be conducting continuous improvement on our recently implemented version 2. We'll be evaluating what's working, what needs to be improved. We'll be collecting that information and evaluating it through change requests over the course of the year. As you know, version 3 of the reference model was just released last month, so we're going to be reviewing the updates and determining how it will impact our file structure and what changes we should make, and we'll probably develop a plan to implement early next year. So thank you, and if there's any questions, I think they're going to be funneled through Karen or Jim, and this is just a reminder to join the TMF Reference Model Yahoo group for knowledge sharing, networking, and too much fun.
Thank you, Wendy. Karen, have you gotten any questions that have been forwarded to you?
I do, thanks, Jim. So thank you, everybody. Just a couple of questions. We've only got, a couple of minutes anyway. A couple of questions about how we use sub-artifacts in terms of, you know, could they be effectively additional folders? The reason we've been very, very unprescriptive about sub-artifacts is you can slice and dice them in any way. So, for example, if you had a meeting materials, your sub-artifacts could be all the different types of materials, but equally you could have you could effectively, in the paper world, for example, or even in an electronic world, have effectively what we want. Your sub-artifact could be like the date of the meeting or the number of the meeting, and then you could have the different documents inside. So really, there are no rules around sub-artifacts. It's just trying to get people to understand that you can get more granularity in whichever way you want. And actually, the granularity, the way you get the granularity will depend on if it's paper, if it's a folder-based electronic, or if it's metadata-driven. Another question that we had was, and again, I think this probably relates more to paper, is about having under section names, having the site names and under each. So basically, how you would structure it with section, zone, and artifact. Sorry, yes, zone, section, and artifact, and basically the way you would do it in the paper world is for every site you would have your zone sections and artifact, or for every country you would have your zone section and artifact. So you're bringing together effectively two what I would call trees. I will reply to the person who sent the email in case I can, because that's probably not enough detail to answer the question at the moment. There was a very interesting question about IRT notifications. Now, that's a very specific conversation piece that we had for ages about, do we include IRT notifications in the TMF, or do we just have an overall summary or a report in the TMF? I'm going to get this email and send it out to the zone lead or the steering committee lead, because I think that's worth a separate conversation. And I had one other question, which is where the TMF reference model guide is available. It should be on tmfreferencemodel.com. If it isn't, I will double check and make sure that it is put there. And I will email you and send you the link to it as well. Thank you for the question. I think that, bearing in mind we're over time, I think that's all. Todd, did you have any?
Just the IRT notifications. The context of the discussion was we removed IRT notifications as an artifact because it was duplicative with records that were inclusive in other artifacts like shipment records, randomization records, things like that. We left in context for user account type notifications and other things. That was where the version 3 project landed.
Okay.
Just for
I might do a connection between you and the person who raised the question as well then, Todd, so you can take the conversation further.
Sure.
Brilliant. Okay, well, that's all from me. Thank you very much, Jim.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody, and we apologize for the technical difficulties with the audio. We will be sending out copies of the slides as well as posting a recording of the actual presentation on the website. Again, thank you very much.
As long as the recording works, Jim, so we're going to have to wait and see if it works.
That is correct. Thank you very much, everybody. Appreciate your patience. Bye-bye.
Take care, everybody. Bye.